I've been an entrepreneur pretty much my whole life, but having done it for 25 years and being where I am now and having seen what I've seen, I have a lot of really kind of deep-seated biases about certain things. And I'm going to share some of those with you that look back, I wish someone had shared with me on my journey as an entrepreneur at your stage of development and at your age and your position. As Becca said, I'm an alum of the University of Delaware, and I'm also a business major. I did a double concentration in marketing and finance, and I knew from the time I was 10 I wanted to be an entrepreneur, so business school seemed like the logical choice. There was absolutely no programming and no education around entrepreneurship when I was here. I got a great education. I love being at the university. I love getting a business degree from here. But literally, there was nothing around entrepreneurship. And to walk into a space like this and to see the commitment that the university has made around entrepreneurship is incredibly encouraging to me. I joke that the one class that I had that was anything to do with entrepreneurship was actually managerial accounting. It was a required class. We had to take managerial accounting. And in hindsight, it's literally the only class that I had that I was able to apply in my entrepreneurial career. And this brings me to one of my first biases, and we'll kind of go out of order on the biases. But the thing that I learned that I thought was fundamentally important in has anyone, do you have to take that still? It was accounting 208.
The only one that I've used.
Yeah, 208, right? So it's how to understand financial statements and balance sheets to make business decisions, not to pay your taxes, not to get bank finance, not to do any of those things, but how do you understand the numbers in your business on the P&L and on the balance sheet to make better decisions. That's what I took away from my 40-year business education. That managerial accounting class was the most important class that I took, which you wouldn't think, of all the things. All the classes. Now, if you need Procter & Gamble to hire a brand manager for Tide and give them a $50 million budget, I learned a lot about that. I think I could probably still do that. But that was the kind of education that was going on here in the 90s. And it's amazing to see now that we're embracing and teaching entrepreneurship. I have this passion about entrepreneurship. I think it's the most important thing that's happening in our country and in the world right now. There are huge corporations that are kind of doing their thing and providing a lot of value in the world, and they provide some jobs. But they're so insular and they're so protected and they've got so much critical mass that they don't need a lot of help. And then there's this whole other area of startups. And a lot of you guys are involved in the startup world, and that's exciting, and it gets a lot of attention, and it garners resources and support. But then there's this middle market area called growth companies, like scaling growth companies. And it's those growth companies that are creating all the momentum in our economy. Now, you have to have startups to create growth companies, but it's the growth companies that 7 out of every 10 jobs are created in the United States by a growth company. If you look politically around the world, stable governments and stable political areas have a higher percentage of growth companies than unstable political areas. And it's this middle market that gets forgotten. It's not a startup hair salon on Main Street, and it's not IBM. It's all these amazing, innovative companies that are doing cool things, creating jobs, but they're getting beat on by the giant companies, and they're not getting the governmental support that the smaller companies are getting, and it gets forgotten. And that's one of the things that I really think we need to change here and around the world is we really need to foster these growth companies that are creating all the momentum. So a really cool thing has happened over the last 10 years, and I believe right now it is the greatest moment in history to be an entrepreneur. And I think the reason that universities are catching up on this idea of teaching entrepreneurship is because we are at the most important moment in time for entrepreneurs. And as I went through my studies here at Delaware, we obviously studied a lot of business history. And I often wondered what it would have been like in the 1850s, the 1900s, to be one of the industrialists, right? One of the robber barons. So you had this vast United States that was just starting to develop, and the opportunities here were incredible. If you could go west, if you could build railroads, if you could do steel and banking, and all these amazing industrialists came out of that period. But there was one limitation back then that over time became more and more of a challenge, and that was physical resources, right? You had to get physical resources, you had to have things and stuff and build and create, but it was all physical. And in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've migrated from physical to digital. And now the only limitation for resources as an entrepreneur is your imagination. If you can imagine it, it can be created digitally and scaled unlimitedly. That's not a word. I went to University of Delaware and I got an education here and I use words like unlimited. So that's the only limitation now is your imagination. We've run out of the physical side of things. You couldn't wake up tomorrow and say, I want to build a railroad. But you can wake up tomorrow and say, I want to build something as significant as a railroad. And if your imagination's there and you can scale it digitally, you can make it happen. Maybe you could build a railroad, I don't know, but it seems like a big undertaking. Lots of stuff. So we're at the most important moment in time for entrepreneurs. It's an amazing time to be an entrepreneur. You guys are given a gift by getting the exposure that you're getting now and the experience that you're getting now and learning from people that have gone before you. I started my company, I graduated. I graduated from here in 1992. I started my first company in 1993. I knew nothing. There was the Small Business Development Center. That was kind of like a hybrid, we'll try and help you, but they did a decent job, but there wasn't a lot of education. I had no idea what I was doing. Everything I did, I had to learn from scratch. And it's hard. Like it's hard with not having people that have gone before you to learn from. So use the resources around you. Learn as much as you can from people that have gone before you. I love to see the Startup Advisory Office. It's amazing that you can sit with people that have been down the path and shorten the cycle on all that learning. Like the idea around understanding financial statements and balance sheets, one of my biases. I couldn't spell balance sheet, let alone understand what it meant. I work with growth company entrepreneurs all the time. It's what I do for a living now as an investment banker and as an advisor. 7 out of 10 of the entrepreneurs we work with still don't understand financial statements and balance sheets. So that's my children. I have a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And other than the basics of parenting, the one thing I want to make sure I impart on them is this understanding of financial statements. So that's my one bias around that. But more important than the financial statements, there's something going on right now. As great a moment in time as we have around entrepreneurship, there is a massive disservice being done to especially young startup entrepreneurs. And it's being done, I think, in the media. It's being done in business writing and publications. There's this mystique around the idea of startups and what are we trying to achieve with startups. And my bias is I am a fundamentals guy. I am a business fundamentals fanatic. I'm a strategy fanatic. Fundamentals say if $1 in revenue comes in, spend less than that dollar in expenses and keep what's left. That's fundamentals, right? I built my businesses. I started the first one in 93. I sold it in 95. I started another one in 95. I sold it in 2012. And we grew those businesses using fundamentals. We grew those businesses by creating value for customers and getting dollars in, spending less than we brought in, and holding on to the profit. But right now in our world, that's not the entrepreneur that's being coveted. That's not the entrepreneur that's being covered. That's not the entrepreneur that's having movies made about. And we've coined a phrase at STS because we've worked with so many now growth company entrepreneurs. We've coined the phrase the Mark Zuckerberg effect. Now, Mark's running a great business, obviously, at Facebook. They're doing pretty well. And, ironically, the fundamentals at Facebook have gotten very solid. But Mark's story wasn't about fundamentals. Mark's story was about create something for free, give it away to the masses, create massive valuation in the venture world, and then ultimately turn it into an IPO and a success story. But for every Mark, there are 1,000 almost Facebooks. We can remember some of them. How many people have a MySpace page? Right? So there's only one Facebook. There's only one Google. There's only one Uber. And we have this bias in our country now around unicorns. And how do we create the next unicorn? I read an amazing article in Fortune magazine called The Next Uber for X. Right? Everyone wants to create an Uber for X. Well, guess what's happening to all the Uber for X's? They're going out of business. Because they don't have the fundamentals and they're not able to create that critical mass. Now, Uber is probably the most celebrated unicorn that we have, right? Anyone know the valuation right now, the VC-backed valuation of Uber? $51 billion. It's the most valuable private company in history from a venture-backed valuation standpoint. Anyone want to guess the revenue? I was shocked when I found this out. Well, I biased you, but anyone want to guess the revenue of Uber? In 14, roughly. How much? 5 billion. Any other guesses? 10 billion. Remember, 51 billion with a B in valuation. Any other guesses?
Really low, I remember looking that. Low for the valuation.
500 million. I would have been where you were. I would have thought about 5 billion. In 2014, now these are private numbers, but they've been released because people are, investing and some stuff leaked out. Uber did 200 million in revenue in 2014. Now, one of the next most important, or probably the more important stat: how much money did Uber make on their 200 million in revenue? Yes. Lost 800. You're very close. They lost somewhere in the magnitude of about $500 million. Negative $500 million. How can Uber exist? How can they exist? Because a massive amount of people have poured $51 billion in venture capital into them. So they have cash to scale this thing, to lose $500 million a year and laugh about it. They laugh about it in the media when it comes out, yeah, of course we lose money. So they are playing a very high stakes game. Now, that doesn't mean they're playing the wrong game, but they're playing a very high stakes game. And unfortunately, I want to be the Uber for X. So now I think about how am I going to do groceries and home services and maid services and all these things. And I'm going to base it on this business model that's become literally like the de facto standard of the unicorn business model. But there are really serious flaws in the fundamentals. And it's those if you can't get your own 51 billion in venture capital, then you have a really good chance of ruining your life by trying to be the Uber for X. And I guess my bias here is on the path to all these unicorns are thousands of entrepreneurs that thought that model was right, and the model is not right. For the vast majority. It's like coming to the University of Delaware and playing football because you think you're going to play in the NFL. Yeah, we have a couple NFL players from Delaware, but there's probably 15,000 kids that have gone through the football program, and I think we put 5 in the NFL. It's very similar with unicorns. And I'm not saying don't pursue it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying understand how fundamentals drive business success. And as you venture out into the world to be entrepreneurs, shoot for the Uber, but do it from a fundamentals perspective. And that's, I guess, my number one takeaway. We work with lots and lots of growth company entrepreneurs on the investment banking side of the house. And they often come to us and say, hey, I need to raise money. Can you help us raise money? So which I ask, why? What do you need? Why do you need to raise money? Well, that's the next thing we're supposed to do. Well, how do you want to raise money? Well, we want to, we want to do an A round, and a B round, and start throwing out all the, the cool buzzword things. And then I start asking questions like, well, how much equity are you going to give away? Oh, we didn't think of that. Well, what's it going to cost if, your model's starting to work? Like your fundamentals are good, your model's starting to work. You want to sell and give away equity now and raise money. Like, what's that going to cost you down the road when you scale? Oh, I never thought of that. We just know we need to raise money because that's what you do next. And again, our bias is you want to understand the fundamentals, the financials, the balance sheets, the P&L, to know there are times when it's right to raise money, but not because it's the next thing to do. There's times to raise money because it's for the health of the business. And it's cool, right? I mean, it's cool to raise money. It's really cool to be venture-backed. I have a really good friend. He's got a venture-backed company that I'm an investor in. It's by every measure, it's an amazing business. They do about $25 million in revenue. They've got about $400 million venture valuation. They're a 7-year-old company. They've never made a penny in profit. They burn about $1 million a month today. They spend $1 million more than they bring in. 7 years into the business. They're venture-backed and they're aiming for an IPO. My buddy who started it, he now owns about 4% of the company that he owned 100% of. And had he just focused on the fundamentals and not the venture guys, he would probably own about 90% of about an $8 million company, about $2 million EBITDA, and probably worth somewhere between 40 and 50 million. And 80% of 50 million is a whole lot better than 4% of a company losing money that hopefully one day may or may not IPO. So, but that's what he was intrigued. He was in love with the idea of he could be venture backed. He's backed by Enrock and Hummer Windblatt, like all the marquee names. But he's given his company away. I used to go to a program at MIT called Birthing of Giants. It was a summer program. It was a week-long, the most remarkable business program ever. If you can ever get into that program, I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's the most significant thing I've ever done in my life. And I learned some incredible lessons in that room. The Roomba. Anyone know what a Roomba is? The vacuum cleaner, that like robot. Invented at MIT. 3 MIT graduate students invented the Roomba. Went through the whole, venture, private equity, the whole, like you name it. If there was a buzzword around it, that's how they ran the business. 3 founders of Roomba. They invent the robot. They do the whole thing. They come in very smugly, tell the story about how great they are. We invented the Roomba. And then we finally got to the end and the punchline of the story. Those 3 graduate students at the end, their percentage of ownership in the Roomba and the company, they split $2.7 million among 3 of them. Spent 14 years of their most productive years of their life to scale the Roomba. And the VCs made a lot of money, and the private equity guys made a lot of money, and a lot of people made a lot of money. The 3 founders of the Roomba split $2.7 million. And I could go on and on and on and on. There's lots of stories like this. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying don't pursue venture and don't pursue private equity and don't pursue fundraising. What I'm saying is, if you can take away from this, go in with your eyes open as entrepreneurs, create value in the world, focus on the fundamentals, and hold on to as much as you can as long as you can. And think through, what does it mean if I take on capital? What does it mean if I take on venture? Don't just think it's the next thing to do. And that's one of my huge takeaways. I love the Uber story. I was totally blown away by that. And in the article, Fortune mentioned that through the first half of 2015, this staggers me, through the first half of 2015, over 100 companies pre-revenue, as in no customers, no revenue, no anything, pre-revenue, over 100 in the first 6 months of 15 had raised over $100 million. And I'm thinking about how healthy this could be for our economy. Like, that can't be healthy for the economy that we're pouring all these resources into pre-revenue startups. In 2014, 126 companies raised over $100 million pre-revenue to startups. Those are staggering numbers. Now, Silicon Valley is starting to catch on. Bill Gurley's an investor in Uber. He's been incredibly adamant about the fact that we're overspending on startups. And here's what happens. Here's the problem. So I started my company, and it sounds like a cliche, but I literally slept at my office for the first 2 years. In fact, I moved into a commercially zoned apartment to make sure I could sleep there. And we were a call center company, one of the most boring businesses. I should probably tell you my story. I started a call center company in 1995, answering the phone for companies. companies would have calls come in, they couldn't take them themselves, and Dopey me would sit there and answer them and take messages. I started it in 95. I was pretty much the only employee for most of 95 and 96 because I couldn't afford anyone. And we were open 24/7, 365. So I lived there. I had a buzzer next to my bed when the phone rang, it would wake me up. And, I don't remember 1997, I was so sleep deprived. But I started it and I scaled it up. So I grew it through 2000 and then decided to become serious. I was what I call a make-believe entrepreneur. Like I thought I was a business guy, but I was totally winging it. And then in 2000, I started serious, got some education, and the business was just starting to get healthy. And then 2003, we did our first acquisition. We went and bought another company. If you guys were here for Ralph Citrullo's talk, that same story, he probably talked about buying the companies. That was my company as well. That was a company that I found. So it was called Apple Tree Answers. So we buy our first company in 2003. We buy another one 60 days later. We convinced a local bank, who's WSFS, to lend us more money in 2003 than we did in revenue in 2002, which is an amazing story by itself. And then we grew it from there. We did it 24 acquisitions, 650 employees, all over the United States, about 35 million in revenue, and we did it 100% with bank and seller financing. 100%. We never took a penny of capital of our own, and we never ever took outside money to grow the business. So we grew that business through 2012. We were able to buy companies for about 3 to 3.5 times EBITDA. And because we had built a nice business with great margins and engaged employees and lots of cool stuff, we were able to sell the business in 2012 for 14 plus times EBITDA. So great story, great return. But had we in the early days taken on capital, it would have been a completely different outcome. So again, I'm biased around this. We have so many people that come to us that are looking to raise money and give away equity early. Every dollar in equity that you give away early can be really expensive at the end. And I'm not saying it's not the way to go. I'm just saying educate yourselves on all the different options and all the different fundamentals, and try not to get caught up in the trap of it's sexy to take on outside money. It's sexy to be venture backed. Does anyone know the venture model, what their North Star is in venture capital? What they're trying to achieve?
The rate of return, or what?
Yeah, like what are the outcomes at a really successful venture firm? If they're going to buy 10 companies, what's their like North Star outcome? Yeah, so the old model. Now it's worse today, but the old model was we're going to buy 10, we're going to fail 7, and we want to fail them fast. If they're not going to make it, we're going to fail them. So we're going to lose all of our investment on 7. We're going to have 1 break even. We're going to have 2 succeed, and 1 of the 2 will be a 20x plus return. And that's how we can more than double our money. Today, 8 out of 10 are going to fail. 1's going to break even, and we're going to get a 20x return from 1, which lets us double our money, plus a little return for time. That's really a scary model if you're one of the companies that are backed, right? So you have an 8 or 9 in 10 chance of not making it with a VC. And the other thing VCs want is control. So their whole thing is about how do we come in and get like complete control. You're not the entrepreneur anymore. You're one of our employees. If you're lucky, you can stay. In my buddy's case, Al, like he owns 4%, but he's gone. Like they fired him. To get fired from your own company is fascinating to me. Like the whole reason to be an entrepreneur is to create all this independence, and then you get fired from your own company. Steve Jobs had it happen to him. It's remarkable. But so that's kind of my ranting bias on business fundamentals. And I'll leave you with one thing. There's a writer for Inc. magazine who's a friend of mine. His name's Norm Brodsky. And Norm has what I think is one of the coolest formulas for how to decide on a potential startup. And you're going to hear it and be like, that's stupid. But I've watched him scale a bunch of businesses using this model. And I really think it's, again, as a food for thought thing, I think it's something interesting to think about. He looks at 3 things when he looks at an opportunity. Number 1, he wants to be in an industry that's at least 50 years old, which sounds like the most archaic, dumb idea ever, right? 50 years old. Number 2, recurring revenue. And I was in a recurring revenue business. I can't speak highly enough about being in recurring revenue businesses. If you want to sleep better at night, being a recurring revenue business, don't have to wake up every day and figure out where your next customer dollar is coming from. Recurring revenue means a predictable and recurring revenue stream. So in my case, we had about 10,000 customers that paid us to answer their phones, and they would pay us a base rate every month, and then they would pay if they went over their allotment of minutes. But it's subscription, yeah. And I can give you, there's a great book by a guy named John Warlow called The Automatic Customer. The Automatic Customer is all about how to take any business and create a subscription model, a recurring revenue model.
Who's that again?
John Warlow, Warrilow. I'll give you a couple book recommendations if you're interested. But recurring revenue, predictable revenue, we can call it that. It doesn't necessarily have to be like completely predictable, but as much predictability in the revenue cycle as possible. And then number 3, this is the one where Norm wins every time. An industry that you can absolutely dominate from a technology standpoint. So he looks for businesses that are antiquated around technology. He's a technologist for sure, but he wants to get into businesses where, like for instance, he had a storage business, a records document managed storage business. And he was able to create technology that put him light years ahead of his competitors. I was in the boring call center answering service business. We use technology to be so differentiated from our competitors that we couldn't even talk to customers in the same conversation as our competitors because we were so different technologically. So old, tried and true, predictable businesses that you can absolutely dominate with technology are a massive opportunity. And that's just one, but that's a way to shape your thinking around, again, we've been biased by the media that it's cool to follow the unicorn path, and I think it's cool to build a fundamentals-based business and do it in a really remarkable way. Amazing technology, incredible business systems and process, really well run, and in old industries. And you have massive opportunity there. Now, there's people in this room that are going to go on and they're going to build unicorn-style software companies, and they're going to make my talk look like it was complete nonsense. And hopefully there'll be no one in the room that tries to do that and ends up on that road of almost Facebook and almost Uber. But I just want to share with you kind of, my backstory and where my bias comes from. So the thought that I'll leave you with, and I think the thing that probably compelled me the most to be successful, and it's another somewhat cliche, but it was really, really important, and I think it goes back to this idea of when you get funding and you get especially startup capital, there's almost dues that have to be paid on the journey of being an entrepreneur, and you guys are doing it here. I love that it's 24/7, and I really love there's a shower, right? You need to be willing to push all in. And being an entrepreneur is not a part-time thing. I have friends that have 4 startups at the same time, and amazingly, none of them scale. It is one of those things where it is a lifestyle commitment to be an entrepreneur. And it sounds cliche to say you need the mindset that success is just not an option, but to really go on this journey, success or failure is not an option, and it needs to be in your core that whatever it takes, we're going to scale this business. And it's not for everybody. It's the most remarkable journey I think you can go on if you're wired that way, but it's not a part-time, right? Being a part-time entrepreneur is a recipe for often disaster. And I had some really dark days in my journey as an entrepreneur. It's a very lonely journey, but I could not live any other life than the one that I live. I think it's the most remarkable, rewarding thing you can do. But every chance I get to talk to people, especially at your age and position in life and kind of where you are in your journey, I like to, as much as I can, open your eyes to a couple things. 1, understand P&L. 2, understand capital and taking on capital and what venture is and equity, all those things. And 3, understand the commitment that it takes to go on this journey. And if you're cut out for it, I think it's the most amazing thing there I could not see living any other way. And that's what I talked about, independence. It's the most independent life. And then as we grew, we used bank finance. The inflection point moment for us was where we were at a point where we had really serious capital needs. Instead of going to private investors or PE or those types, we used bank debt. Startup capital is tougher. I mean, there's grants, there's friends and family. Certainly, you can take on outside capital. It wouldn't be a terrible idea to take on a partner early on. I am so fiercely independent. I'm almost I had a partner in Ralph, but Ralph was a completely silent partner, and I called all the shots. And, that's me. But all the research says one entrepreneur less successful, less likely to succeed than two. Two are less likely than three, and it goes all the way up the chain. 6 people coming together in a partnership, amazingly more likely to succeed than 5. And I think a lot of it is just having like-minded people to share the load. I could never have a partnership with 5 or 6 or 4. I would lose my mind, but that may be a path to think about as well. The startup capital thing is hard. There's lots of sources. My bias is be really careful about that. You can take on mezzanine debt, angel investing. There's other potential ways. Just be really equity is one of those things you really only get to give away one time. And in very rare instances, you can get some of it back, but it's really hard to get back. And $1 in equity as $1 million company is a whole different discussion than $1 in equity as a $30 million or a percentage point of equity from $1 million to 30, which is our goal.
As an entrepreneur whose schedule is different every day, how do you create good habits?
I don't have very good habits. It came down to discipline, I guess. I'm a learner. I'm a lifelong. I still spend 40 days a year on executive education, and I teach as much as I learn. But I'm a total learner, and I went through every time management. I was a consumer of all the different flavors. There's a really good. I'm trying to remember his name. His first name's Ari, A-R-I. If you Google Ari, A-R-I, efficiency expert, I'm sure you'll find him. But he's created a whole kind of universe of tools and ideas around how to stay really disciplined and efficient, outsourcing a lot of functions, that kind of stuff. But I was not a very disciplined entrepreneur. Like many of you, I'm guessing I was pretty ADD and kind of flavor of the week, and that was a challenge for me to stay disciplined. Now, when your business is failing at the epic level that mine was, that gets you pretty focused. I burned out really bad too. So 99, I gave the business. I let one of my literally crazy employees run it for 4 months. Never came into the office once. That was another dark moment. I was pretty burned out. But then when it goes through cycles of refresh and burnout. But if you're naturally disciplined, it's easier. I'm not a naturally very disciplined. So good question.
So how did you take your business from make-believe, as you were saying, to a real business? What were some of the changes that you made?
So number one was we were on we started from scratch, and I was on a really homemade kind of call center equipment platform. We bought an enterprise level IT solution basically. So our IT went from mom and pop to enterprise. We hired a salesperson in 2000, late 99. So I was 5 years in, I was the only sales guy. By the way, you will most likely be the best salesperson your business ever has, ever, and it's the worst job you can do as the entrepreneur. And it took me 5 years to get past that. So I hired a sales guy. We got serious about spending dollars on marketing and advertising. Those were probably the big 3. And then along the path, one of the really important things that I didn't realize at the time, but in hindsight was hugely important, was getting into the right office space. We were in Class C office space, just sort of spinning our wheels. And I couldn't afford A space, but actually Ralph Secure was in A space, and there was an open suite next to him, and we signed a lease that I could not afford at all. And why the landlord let me sign it, I have no idea. But we moved into that A space, and then all of a sudden we start to attract A player people, and the leadership team got better. I'm a massive believer in the physical environment has to mirror the culture and the story of the business. I'm not telling you to go out and overspend on office space. I'm telling you that your office space is a reflection of you and your business, and you can't attract talented people if you don't have attractive space. Big, I'm a huge believer.
Back to the getting the startup capital, you said be wary of getting venture capitalists in there. Do you feel the same way almost as a crowdsourcing?
No, crowdsourcing is, I mean, we're going to have to see how crowdsourcing evolves, right? Because the SEC can't make up their mind about it. But finally, I think they're going to allow startup capital to be funded through crowdsourcing. It looks like anyway. But crowdsourcing really is an innovative way. You're not giving up a lot of equity there. It's more pre-selling product than anything. There's some great crowdsourcing stories. I don't know if you guys know the Beehive, the Urban Beehive story. Yeah, I mean that like they didn't give it. You know, if you get a chance, I think they were funded on crowd. Does anybody know? Was it on crowdsource or I don't think it was Indiegogo, but
Kickstarter.
two guys from Australia, a father and son, create this urban beehive, and it's literally this wooden thing. It sells for about $800. Bees make their hive in there, and you hook on jars, and honey drips out, and you get it produces honey, and it does all sorts of environmental products. Bees are great. They're like the greatest thing ever, and we're losing them or something. But so these guys start this beehive thing on. I want to say it was crowdsourcing. Who was it? It was Kickstarter, you're right. And in their goal was to sell like $100,000 worth of beehives at $800 a piece. Within 48 hours, they had $12 million in revenue, and when the campaign closed, it was like $22 million in revenue. And the guy I know, the business speaker that tells the story, goes, "How many of you had a $12 million startup in 48 hours?" And everybody laughs. Nobody has a $12 million startup, but there's some great crowdsourcing stories there. I think it's actually really good.
So have you ever experienced a company who wasn't scaling properly? Like they went too fast or they were going too slow? And like, do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, we come across them all the time. And too fast is much more rare than too slow. And really it comes back to the fundamentals and to the discipline of operating the business systematically. We recommend a business process called the Rockefeller Habits. It's another great book if you want to read that. Actually, my company, there's a chapter in there on Apple Tree. The book's called Scaling Up. It's written by a guy named Vern Harnish. Vern's probably, I think, the leading authority globally on how to build a scaling company. I think it's a great resource, that book. While we're on the subject, I think the greatest business book ever written is a very simple to read book about a pie store called The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber. Again, if you're a fundamentals guy, you'll understand why that's the greatest business book ever. It's all about business fundamentals. It's all about systems and process. It's all about how to scale. It's nothing about how to have 100 employees and lose $3 million a month. But it's, I think, really, really good book. Okay, we'll go here. And then.
So you talk a lot about not necessarily going after venture funding.
Mhm.
There are possible avenues.
I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm
Yeah,
just
not
saying
saying not.
be eyes open.
Yeah. So what would you say about going to a bank or because with investor funding, you don't necessarily have to
So you're right. With investor funding, you don't necessarily have to pay them back, but you want to build a business that you can be able to pay them back. Bank financing is going to be hard as a newly minted college student, or someone that's in a new startup mode. It's going to be hard to get bank financing. So from a startup capital perspective, I'd probably lean more towards friends and family. But I know we're kind of hanging up on this point. The bigger point is make sure from the very outset that your goal is to build a business that sustains itself. So in that Fortune article, it talks about Microsoft. Microsoft sold 5% of their company for $1 million on a $20 million valuation. So that's early days, obviously. They were already sustainable at that point. So you contrast that with, and Uber's the wrong example, but contrast it with my buddy's company, 7 years in, still losing $1 million a month. Microsoft took $1 million in capital. They were already self-sustaining. So the message here is bootstrap it and build the business from the very beginning to be self-sustaining, and then the capital is easier and easier to come by, and less expensive. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's, I think, kind of fun. I'm going to go here, then I'll go here.
I'll let we only have a few more minutes because I know people got to get to class, so I'll let you guys.
Oh, you guys still have to go to class? All right, so we'll go.
Quick one, what was the name of that article?
It was called, it was something like The Danger of Uber for X. Yeah, it was Fortune, it was in August of 15. And it was, if you Google Fortune Uber for X, it should come. Yeah.
So if we were to decide to sell off some equity, how much do you suggest we give away? Is there like a certain number you want to stay above?
That's a great question. So never, ever, unless you absolutely are like desperate, sell controlling interest. So 51%, or 49%, absolutely. But a stake that's meaningful enough for the investor, but insignificant enough for you to get the capital you need, and you're not going to have someone that's. Every investor you take on has rights. They have legal rights. Now, they may not have majority rights, but every investor has legal rights. I watched a buddy of mine in Canada that took his company from public to private. He had one investor that owned like 1/3 of 1%, and he held him up for 6 months over like $60,000. I mean, guys, cost him $500,000 in legal fees because of one investor. So every investor's got legal rights when they own an equity stake in your business. I guess the answer would be as little as possible to get the capital that you need, but never controlling interest.
So 51 would be the
49, you'd sell 49 and you'd hold on to 51. I'll tell you one more sidebar story. We have an investment banking client right now who's built an incredible software as a service company in the mutual fund space. Amazing. Profitable, revenue, growing, awesome. And he took on capital when he didn't need it because he thought he had to. And then he took another round. And he literally woke up one day, and you're going to think I'm like full of it, no one can verify. He woke up one day and realized he had inadvertently given away 95% of his company. Because he had this vision that he was going to get to 100 million, but he didn't do the quick math. 5% of 100 million is way worse than like 80% of 10 million. So he had given away 95%. And now he's in a fight to get it back, to get back 15 to get to 20%. And we're working with him to help him do that. But through no fault of his own, but he just, another round, and he got so diluted